Hello, everyone. Welcome to this exciting new series where we are talking about some of the classics of Buddhist literature here in the West. We'll be looking at traditions across Buddhism. So it's not just Tibetan Buddhism, for example. In fact, by any indication, the first few talks that we'll be doing around Zen will probably point directly to that. And this is a good continuation for anyone who's done the Genuine Being series. For anyone who's new to the online community, don't worry. It's not like you all of a sudden are going to be left out in the cold, because we're going to go through the entirety of the Buddhist path through these 6 books. And I think this is a good way for us to deepen our own study. For those of us who will be reading along through the books, you'll find that this is a chance for us to actually go into some of the most essential writing in Buddhism that's been translated here or created here. And these are certainly texts that have inspired me. Just from a personal perspective, all of these are on my bookshelf, and they're something that I read and reread every few years. Any of the writing, if you've read any of my work, it's deeply influenced by these authors and teachers. And often you'll find them quoted, these very texts, in my work. So this is it's a great joy for me to do. And I want us to actually talk about some of the foundational stuff that is just based in waking up to who we truly are / our meditation practice, because those two go hand in hand. Now, again, if you do not read these books along the way, that's okay. You can hopefully still get a lot out of this talk if I'm clear. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the essence of Zen practice, or the essence of practice overall, we could say. Because when we talk about the essence of practice from a Zen perspective, it's good for us to get these different perspectives. We have a Zen perspective. Obviously, I come from Tibetan Buddhist background primarily. There's insight perspectives, all sorts of things. And they're all pointing to the same thing. It's a little bit like many people describing a dog. Now you could say, oh, that's a brown dog, sort of a light tan brown, it's a really nice coat. You could talk about the dog from the perspective of the type of tail. This sort of breed has that type of tail, and you can tell it's that type of breed because of that tail. You could say this is the sort of dog that was bred for hunting, or this was the sort of dog who was bred for laps. But we're all describing the same dog. So however we talk about it, it's the same dog. And in fact, the more descriptors we have, the clearer the image of the dog becomes in our own mind. I hope that makes sense. Same thing when it comes to the Dharma, or as we would say, the teachings of the Buddha. It said that the Buddha himself offered 84,000 skillful means to help us individuals start to understand the simple truth. And as he said himself, that all he taught was suffering and the end of suffering. So the Zen perspective is very much interested in that end of suffering. Suzuki Roshi comes from the lineage of Dogen. You'll probably see Dogen referenced if you read the text, who established the Soto school of Buddhism. There's already Zen teachings in Japan, but he went over to China and said, I want to go right to the heart of where this developed, and came back to Japan and established the Soto Zen school. Soto Zen is known for just sitting, which, maybe those of us that have been meditating for some time, we're like, that sounds very boring, but this is the essence of the practice of just sitting. Suzuki Roshi himself was born at the turn of the century. He flew in 1959 to San Francisco from Japan. He was the age of 55 then. And he was sent over to become the minister of what was then the Soto Zen mission. And that was primarily to cater to Japanese and Japanese American Buddhists. And yet, because he was so accessible in his teachings, he quickly started attracting all manner of people. And wherever he went, people would establish a little study group, and they would keep studying the talks that he gave, and they would start sitting together regularly. And there's a very big community that developed in California in particular, over the next several years, Suzuki Roshi actually died in 1971. So if we think about it, he was only in the States for about a decade. Sorry, 12 years, a dozen years. And yet he accomplished so much in that time, the least of which may very well be this very thin volume that he has gifted to us called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And it is 10,000 descriptors, maybe, or several dozen, looking over at the text, descriptors of one point, the Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. So what is this title itself? He says, the purpose of studying Buddhism is not to study Buddhism, but to study ourselves. And I do love that quote, and I think about it often, that the purpose here of the work that we're doing is not to become really knowledgeable and fill our heads with a lot of concept, but to actually come into an understanding of who we truly are. So if all the Buddha taught is suffering and the end of suffering, he only taught the suffering part so that we would be understanding of it, so as to avoid it, so that we could move to the end of suffering. That's all he taught, suffering and the end of suffering. So here we have a teacher, Suzuki Roshi, telling us that the way we do this, the way we study to overcome suffering, is not to get really good at Buddhism, but to study ourselves. To be with ourselves long enough to get to know ourselves, where we come up against that suffering, where we come up against our hindrances and our confusion and our pain points and our delusion, and to let that go. To become so aware of all of the ways that we keep ourselves locked in pain that we no longer want to do them. That's what we do in the practice. So the essence of Zen practice is, they would say Zazen, Z-A-Z-E-N. It's not so different than what we might have referred to in the past as shamatha, calm abiding meditation. It's shamatha being a Sanskrit word. Often in the West, we just call it mindfulness as a catch-all for all of these different types of styles. But the essence of Zazen is to be with our universal nature. So you might hear this term repeatedly in Zen circles, to be with our universal nature. Our universal nature is an acknowledgement that when we actually come to the end of suffering, even for a moment, we glimpse that we are basically whole, complete, awake as is. Often this is referred to as Buddha nature, sometimes as basic goodness, but that's the idea. That we are connecting with our universal nature, this thing that's beyond just a Lodro, or a Diane, or a Tanya, or a Michael, that is actually a part of all of us. It's just this universal aspect that we all possess, this wakefulness within us. So the term Shoshin, S-H-O-S-H-I-N, is Zen mind. Zen mind here is the realization of one's own nature, of one's Buddha nature. It's beyond words, it's beyond expression. So the purpose of Zazen is to experience that Zen mind, to understand reality in as direct a way as possible. So every time we sit down in our own meditation practice, the idea here is that we are waking up to our innate state, if even for a moment. How do we do this? He gets very detailed, right? He says, here's how you do the posture, here's how you work with the breath. You be with the breath. It's not even, I am breathing, Lodro's breathing and doing a good job. Just being, allow that being with to connect you to your Buddha nature. So there's a lot of getting out of our own way in this perspective. That we don't have to attach a lot of ideas, we don't have to attach a lot of concept to the practice itself. In fact, the more we conceptualize the practice, this is a good meditation, this is a bad meditation. My breath is good today, my breath is shallow today and not good. I want to be doing this style of meditation. I don't want to keep sitting and just being with the breath. These are all things that block us from our Buddha nature. So every time we get even into the subtle layers of, oh, maybe I should be doing this, well, maybe my career should be that, we are moving away from that connection, that openness, that presence with, of being with our own Buddha nature. Buddha being open or awake, so wakeful nature. Yeah, so the Buddha, it's generally Tathagata, would be the Sanskrit word, which would be translated as the awakened one. So let's say our wakeful nature is maybe another way to talk about this universal nature that Suzuki Roshi often points to. So this is how we do it. We engage in the practice. I mean, not surprising, right? That the just sitting school would say, how about this? Just sit, right? But we often forget, like, oh yeah, this is the key element. Yes, the mindfulness in my everyday life is important, but it's really rooted in the fact that we spend a good amount of time in practice. But let's talk about that, because that's actually very interesting here too. That there's a lot in this particular Zen practice that's like when we rest in our natural state, we're able to act in skillful ways. So he says Zazen is Zazen. It's not something to accomplish. It's not something to strive for, but something that's waiting to be discovered. This universal nature, wakeful nature, is waiting to be discovered. So the practice itself shouldn't be gaining ideas. We shouldn't try to always clutch for more. I need more to actually become whole, complete, good as is. That's not actually going to help us. It's also different than sitting without purpose. It's not like there's no content, no intention to the practice. Purpose here, we say, I'm going to be with reality as it is. And that's my purpose. And we just sort of hold that intention in our heart. And as Suzuki Roshi said, quote, when you sit, you will sit. When you eat, you will eat. Unquote. This is very common. And you'll see this in other Zen schools as well. Seung San, a famous Korean Zen master, we had many more books to go through. I would recommend this as well. Only Don't Know is a beautiful collection of letters written to this Korean Zen master and his responses. Of course, this is back in the 70s, 60s even. So it's a lot of people typing on typewriters or handwriting their letters, sending them in, and he would respond in the same manner. And it's quite beautiful. Anyway, it's not like, emails with the Zen master, although I'm sure that exists these days. But the letters, he would always talk about don't know mind, which is similar, or the same, I should say, as Zen mind, beginner's mind. This mind that is without concept. So previously we talked about Shoshin, Zen mind. Beginner's mind, it's the same thing. That it's like we're emptying out the concept. That in the expert's mind, there's a lot of concept. There's a lot of, well, it should look like this. It shouldn't look like that. And that can block us from reality as it is, all of that concept. So we want to adopt the beginner's mind, the mind that is just open to things as they are. That's the idea. So we hold this purpose. I'm going to be with reality as it is. And when you sit, you will sit. When you eat, you will eat. So the more we're actually doing this, he talks about it very fluidly, that it's not just, oh, I meditate and I feel good about meditation. It's I meditate and then I'm also present with everything else. I'm also being with the reality of everything else, that when I cook, I cook. In fact, he said to cook or to fix some food is not preparation. According to Dogen, it is practice. So we might say, I'm going to make myself a peanut butter sandwich, and then I'll get back to my meditation. No. There's a deep integration in this perspective of Zen mind, beginner's mind, that what we are doing is actually saying, when I'm cooking the food, when I'm cutting the bread, and I'm putting the peanut butter on, and I'm putting the jelly on, or whatever it is, I'm there. I am with that reality. I'm not mentally preparing to eat the food, to come back to sit, to answer the emails. I'm there. So this level of integration is really interesting. In fact, there's an old story of Suzuki Roshi where in a question and answer session, a student asked, what should a Zen practitioner do with his spare time? And it said that Suzuki Roshi started saying this term over and over again, spare time, spare time, spare time, spare time, as if it was just the most foreign sounding words. And then he just started laughing. Once he started laughing, he couldn't stop laughing. He's laughing uproariously. And that was his response to spare time. Because the view here is that any time is Zen mind, beginner's mind time, right? That whatever we're doing, That when I'm here with you, I'm here with you. And then when I go into a meeting later, I'm in the meeting. And when I have dinner with my wife, I'm with my wife. So this is when I spoke earlier that a lot of the writing that I've done has been influenced by these books. The influence here is this integration. One, I would actually say, before I get into that, is the view of like, actually, what do I even know? That the less I hold on to the ideas and concepts of what Buddhism should be, the more Buddhism itself unveils itself to me, the more I understand. But two, this integration that, starting many, many years ago, at this point it was a full 10 years ago that I was writing The Buddha Walks into a Bar. And all I wanted to do was say, okay, let's integrate this. Let's not just have meditation be this cool niche thing over here, and then we go into the rest of our waking hours and we're a jerk. No, let's actually try to the best of our ability, move in this direction. And I think this is a big part of our path. That we start with, I'm meditating and it's helping me be less stressed out. That's great. Maybe I'm meditating and it's helping me be less stressed out, and I'm even nicer to people. Even better. But at some point, the integration, like the lines between meditation and post-meditation, start to blur a little bit. And it's not even in conscious ways. It's not like you sit down and you say, I'm going to be mindful while I make myself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Although if you want, you could do such things. But it just naturally starts to happen. So I'm pointing at this distinction here, and you could sort of do this work in one of two ways. One is the conscious way of saying, yes, every time I make myself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, that is now a practice for me. I am just present while making that. Or if you don't make yourself many of those, every time I make breakfast, or every time I cook dinner, or every time I take a shower, or every time I brush my teeth, or every time I walk the dog. But taking specific activities and saying, this is the integration. This is where I am just with reality as it is. I'm fully present to the best of my ability, relaxing my mind and being with things, being with reality as it is. That's one way we could proceed. The other is just the unconscious way, which is the more we practice, the more we throw ourselves into it, the more we naturally find ourselves doing that. That we close our computer at the end of a long Zoom meeting and we look up. There's a bird out the window. We just rest. We're just present. It's not, what type of bird is that? I should go get some binoculars. I never bought binoculars. Why didn't? It's just, I'm here. So you might just find these moments happening, and I would love to hear from you what these moments might be. And we can talk about it in our gatherings, because I think this is good to celebrate these moments where we say, oh, wait a second. I may not consider this a huge victory in my meditation practice that I looked at a bird, but it was actually very meaningful. And those are things we should celebrate. Those little wins where we actually are relating to reality fully as it is. So even as I talk about these things, you might have the thought, well, Lodro, that sounds fine and good. I don't know if I've ever had one of those moments. I'm a bad practitioner. I'm not a very good meditation practitioner. I'm quite a bad practitioner. But there's actually a set of teachings here in this book where Suzuki Roshi talks about the horse. He says there's the excellent horse, there's the good horse, there's the not so good horse, there's the worst horse. And he uses this analogy and then makes it very accessible to us Westerners, saying, you could think of yourself like an excellent father. If you think you're an excellent father, you're not going to strive to improve. Because you already think, you've got this concept of yourself that you're so good. But if you think you're the worst father, you're constantly striving to become better, right? So maybe you're sitting here thinking, I'm the worst meditator. Or I'm maybe not the worst meditator, but I would fall into the not so good category. Someday I hope to be a good or excellent meditator, but right now I'm not so good. That's good, because then we strive to actually become a better practitioner. We apply ourselves to the practice more diligently than if we actually think that we have the lucid idea, or the not so lucid idea, the delusion really, of being a great practitioner. And we're spouting like all sorts of wisdom to everyone. Well, you should do what I do, and excellent. We're probably not going to apply ourselves in our practice. We're already sort of full of ourselves. The ego has become very puffed up. So a lot of the Zen practice is emptying out of the ego and allowing ourselves to relax into reality as it is with that beginner's mind, so that we aren't constantly, how else to put this? When we have this solid sense of ego, we're constantly buffering up against reality. And we're trying to fight it and make reality into something that it's not. Let me think of an example. Let's pretend that I'm sitting here saying, I'm a really good husband. And I'm actually the greatest husband. I should write a book just on how to be a good husband. That's a good title. I'll do it. And then my wife turns to me and she goes, you've really been slacking at being a good husband. And then my understanding of reality and the actual case of reality is not in sync anymore, right? So don't worry, this hasn't happened. I'm probably doing so, but it's probably because I have the beginner's mind of there's always more I can be doing. There's always more. Don't start saying I'm the worst husband, but I know that there's a lot of room for improvement over here, and as a result, that means I apply myself. What that looks like for me might be very different than what it looks like for you, but same idea around the meditation practice. That if I am letting go of the concept of best husband, excellent husband that always gets it right, I'm more in tune with reality. I'm more open, and I start to notice those ways that I could apply myself. Oh, I don't do this very much. I think she would like it if I did that more, because I'm actually just showing up and I'm not so clouded by my ego. Hopefully this makes sense. So that we're lifting the veil of ego so we can see the world more clearly. We're being with reality more and more, emptying out our mind to the point that we can have that beginner's mind and be in touch with reality and not cause ourselves so much pain. Coming full circle to that idea of the Buddha and saying, I teach suffering and the end of suffering. If I understand reality and the suffering that takes place, I can actually work more towards the end of suffering, and I'm more inspired to do that. If I think there's no suffering, I'm great, everything's perfect, I will probably get myself into trouble when reality doesn't rise up to meet that expectation. Hopefully that's clear. Another story. A student once asked Suzuki Roshi's advice, thinking that they were probably not the greatest meditator. He said he couldn't stop his thinking in meditation. You know what Suzuki Roshi's response was? Is there some problem with thinking? And I love that, because the idea here is that we don't have to think of ourselves as like doing things wrong, being bad. Even when thoughts arise, they dissolve, we can acknowledge them, we can come back to the breath, fine. But we don't treat ourselves like a problem. We don't treat ourselves as something that's in need of fixing. That's going to block us from our very innate, universal nature, Buddha nature, wakeful nature. So the advice that we are given from this perspective, the essence of the way to practice, is the way to practice without having any goal to limit your activity. Or to be concentrated on what you are doing in this moment. So when we are concentrated on what we are doing in this moment, the universal nature, the wakeful nature, the Buddha nature is there. So the essence of practice is to connect with our universal nature, our Buddha nature, our wakeful nature, over and over again, on the cushion and in the world. Thank you for being with me for this series. I'm very excited because we're going to be going through a wide variety of perspectives. And next time we'll talk more about the traditional Zen spirit, which is sometimes called this tentative use of sudden enlightenment. People want sudden enlightenment, but what do we actually get? Anyway, that's my teaser. Thanks for practicing with me today. Thanks for being here, and I look forward to us discussing this all very soon.